Before we go any further, viewer discretion is strongly advised. What you are about to hear is presented for entertainment and analytical purposes, yet the emotional weight of what unfolded cannot be overstated. This is not simply the story of a celebrity interview gone wrong. It is the story of how a carefully constructed media environment can turn hostile in an instant, how reputation and restraint can be tested under the unforgiving glare of live television, and how even the most composed figures can be pushed to the brink. What happens when a titan of Hollywood, a man whose career has been built on discipline, integrity, and quiet authority, steps into what he believes is a routine promotional appearance, only to discover that the stage has already been set for confrontation? What unfolds when a conversation masquerades as an ambush, and civility becomes nothing more than thin veneer over a premeditated narrative? You are about to witness a moment that burned itself into the collective memory of daytime television. A clash so intense, so emotionally charged, that Kevin Costner's legendary stoicism, honed over decades in one of the most ruthless industries on Earth, finally showed visible fractures under the pressure of a relentless on-air assault. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accidental escalation. This was a calculated spectacle. This was no ordinary interview gone awry. It was a chilling masterclass in the mechanics of televised takedown culture, a stark demonstration of how a promotional tour, designed to celebrate creative work, can be weaponized into a public crucifixion. Every word, every interruption, every raised eyebrow carried weight, and by the time the segment concluded, the damage was impossible to ignore. So brace yourselves, and when this is over, let us know your thoughts in the comments, because the anatomy of this implosion is as fascinating as it is unsettling. For Kevin Costner, the morning began under the comforting illusion of normalcy. It was just another stop on the promotional circuit, another studio, another couch, another polite exchange of anecdotes and reflections. He was riding a wave of critical acclaim following his latest cinematic achievement, a project many were already calling a testament to his enduring relevance in an industry obsessed with youth and trends. He arrived at the View prepared for familiarity, prepared for light conversation, prepared for questions about his storied career, his creative philosophy, and the road ahead. This was, after all, a man who had navigated press tours for decades. A veteran, a professional, a figure admired not just for his talent, but for his unshakable composure. As he took his seat opposite the panel, the set lights gleaming, and the audience murmuring with anticipation, nothing appeared out of place. The stage was set exactly as it always was, and yet, the moment the cameras flickered to life, something shifted. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though an invisible tension had been released all at once. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to anyone trained in reading the rhythms of live television. "So, Kevin, welcome back to the View," Whoopi Goldberg began. Her words were polite, her smile practiced, but beneath the surface there was an edge, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably predatory to seasoned observers. This was not a warm welcome. This was a probe, I have to say. She continued, leaning slightly forward. "I'm intrigued by some of your recent comments regarding the current state of Hollywood, and where you believe the industry is heading." Costner shifted in his seat, just slightly. A minute adjustment, the kind most viewers would miss, but one that spoke volumes. He maintained his professional smile, his posture composed, his voice steady. "Well, Whoopi," he replied calmly, "I believe Hollywood has always been in a state of evolution. My focus has always been on telling meaningful stories, stories that resonate emotionally and connect with audiences on a human level, measured." Diplomatic, safe, but it wasn't enough. "That's a very sanitized version of what you've said, isn't it?" Whoopi interrupted sharply, her tone changing mid-sentence. In one swift motion, she lifted a stack of papers, interview excerpts, headlines, printed quotes, brandishing them like evidence in a courtroom. The message was clear. This was no casual discussion, because according to multiple interviews you've given recently, she pressed on, you seem to hold some very specific views about which stories deserve to be told, and perhaps more importantly, who gets to tell them. A visible current of tension rippled across the panel. The other hosts exchanged glances, their expressions betraying what their words did not. This was no longer conversational. This was confrontational. The atmosphere had shifted from friendly discourse to something far more volatile. Off camera, a silent drama unfolded. Producers watched closely. Audience members leaned forward. The machinery of live television hummed, indifferent to the human consequences about to unfold. And Kevin Costner, calm, seasoned, unflappable Kevin Costner, found himself no longer in an interview, but in the opening moments of a televised reckoning. Costner's publicist, seated just a few feet away, wore an expression that could only be described as quiet panic. It was the look of someone watching a carefully choreographed public appearance unravel in real time, powerless to intervene. Her fingers tightened around the folder on her lap as she shifted uncomfortably in her chair, eyes darting between Costner and Whoopi, silently calculating the fallout that was already beginning to take shape. This was not how the segment had been rehearsed. This was not how it was supposed to go. Whoopi, however, seemed entirely at ease. If anything, she appeared energized, leaning slightly forward in her chair, as if the confrontation itself had sharpened her focus. She pressed on with deliberate precision, each word measured, each pause intentional. "I believe there may be a fundamental misunderstanding of my intended message," Costner replied, his voice calm and even, though a careful listener could detect the faintest tremor beneath the surface. It was the sound of a man working hard to maintain control, to keep his composure intact under pressure. "Could you perhaps clarify which of my comments you are referencing?" For a moment, Whoopi said nothing. Instead, she made an exaggerated show of gathering her papers, rustling them loudly as though searching for something long misplaced. The gesture drew a few uneasy chuckles from the audience, but her expression remained serious, her eyes never leaving Costner's face. "Oh, I have a feeling you know precisely what I'm alluding to," she said at last, her tone cool but edged with unmistakable challenge. "But allow me to jog your memory." She found the page she was looking for and held it up slightly, as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. Then she lowered it and locked eyes with him, refusing to give him the luxury of distance. "You stated, and this is a direct quote, that Hollywood has lost its way and must return to creating films for real Americans." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Would you care to elaborate on what you define as real Americans?" A visible tension rippled through Costner's posture. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, an almost imperceptible signal of irritation or perhaps restraint. Those who had followed his career knew this look well, the calm exterior concealing a storm of emotion just beneath the surface. "I never uttered those specific words, Whoopi," he replied firmly. "What I said, what I meant, was that I am dedicated to creating films that explore the universal human condition, stories about love, loss, resilience, narratives that bring people together rather than divide them." His voice remained steady, but the defensive edge was now unmistakable. He sat straighter in his chair, hands clasped tightly together, as though anchoring himself. "But you see," Whoopi shot back immediately, her voice rising slightly, "that is the very heart of the issue." She leaned back, then forward again, her energy filling the space between them. "When figures like yourself speak about uniting people and real Americans, there is an unspoken implication, whether you intend it or not, that certain stories don't count, that the stories many of us have spent decades fighting to tell, stories centered on people who look like me, people who live on the margins of society, are somehow less authentic, less worthy, less American." A low murmur swept through the studio audience. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the conversation slipping into dangerous territory. The air felt heavier now, charged with emotion and unspoken history. "That is a complete and utter distortion of my words," Costner countered sharply. For the first time, a crack appeared in his polished, professional armor. "I have never suggested that any story, or any person, is less valid than another, and frankly, I am taken aback by the combative nature of this discussion." He spread his hands slightly, palms up, a gesture of exasperation. "I came here to speak about my craft, my work, my passion for filmmaking, not to be cornered, misconstrued, and maligned on national television." The word maligned lingered in the air, drawing a noticeable reaction from the crowd. A few gasps, a few whispers. Even Costner's publicist stiffened, Clearly aware that the exchange had reached a point of no return, Whoopi, however, did not retreat. "Maligned, Kevin," she repeated, her eyebrows lifting. There was no anger in her voice now, only a sharp, controlled intensity. "I am posing legitimate questions based on your own public statements. If those statements carry implications that make entire communities feel excluded, dismissed, or erased, then it is not hostility to ask you to address that. It is accountability." The studio fell silent. Cameras lingered on Costner's face as he absorbed her words, his expression unreadable. In that moment, it was clear that this was no longer a promotional interview or a friendly exchange. It had become something else entirely, a collision of perspectives, power, and lived experience, unfolding live for millions to witness. And there was no easy way out. If one is unable to withstand scrutiny for words one has supposedly spoken, then perhaps those words should never have been uttered in the first place. That was the implication hanging in the air, sharp, accusatory, and unmistakably personal. But Kevin Costner did not retreat. Instead, something in him hardened. "The issue," Kevin said slowly, his voice no longer diplomatic, but forged in unmistakable steel, "is that those are not my words." The shift was immediate and undeniable. Gone was the polite guest navigating a hostile conversation. In his place stood a man who had reached the limits of tolerance. "You are taking fragments," he continued, his voice now edged like a blade, "and twisting them to serve a narrative you walked into this studio with already prepared." He paused, letting the weight of the accusation land. "That," he said firmly, "is not journalism. That is activism wearing a very poor disguise." The studio reacted before anyone spoke. The other hosts began to shift in their seats. Subtle movements, crossed arms, exchanged glances. They could feel it. The ground beneath the conversation was cracking, and the safety rails were gone. This was no longer an interview teetering on discomfort. This was a full-scale derailment, and yet there was no stopping it now. The interview had become a runaway train, and Whoopi Goldberg wasn't merely riding along. She was driving it. "So that's what this is now." Whoopi shot back, her voice sharp with indignation. "I'm suddenly not a real journalist because I'm asking you difficult questions instead of fluffing the pillows for your little movie." The words hung heavy, dripping with sarcasm and challenge. Kevin leaned back slightly, drawing a breath. Behind his eyes a storm churned, decades of experience, restraint, and frustration colliding all at once. He fought for composure, but the strain was visible now. "Look," he began, his voice lower, heavier, weighted with the authority of lived experience. "I've been in this industry for over 40 years. He gestured faintly with his hand, as if motioning toward an invisible timeline stretching behind him. "I have sat through thousands of interviews, friendly ones, tough ones, fair ones, even hostile ones, and in all that time, I can say this without hesitation, I have never been subjected to this level of intentional mischaracterization." The word intentional echoed louder than the rest. "You are not here for a conversation," Kevin declared, his tone now unwavering. "You are here for a confrontation." Before the statement could settle, Whoopi fired back. "The only confrontation happening here," she snapped, "is your refusal to stand by what you said." By now, the point of no return was far behind them. "You made those comments, Kevin," she pressed on. "You cannot simply come on this show and pretend they don't exist just because someone finally challenges you." Kevin leaned forward. "Then show me," he demanded, his voice now simmering with unmistakable heat. "Show me exactly where I said those words." The room seemed to shrink around them. "Show me the direct quote," he continued, his gaze locked onto hers, unblinking. "The exact words where I mentioned real Americans. Show me where I suggested that marginalized communities were somehow less real, less valid, or less worthy." He shook his head slowly, "Because I can assure you, you cannot." A pause. "I never said it." Whoopi lifted her papers again, gripping them tighter now. "I have it right here," she insisted. Multiple sources, multiple interviews. Then read it. Kevin challenged instantly. "Read it word for word." His voice sharpened. "Stop paraphrasing. Stop editorializing. Stop inserting your own meaning into my mouth." The air in the studio seemed to crystallize. A hush fell over the set, heavy and absolute. Even the audience, once restless, now sat frozen, sensing that they were witnessing something rare and irreversible. Whoopi flipped through her notes, once confident, now frantic. Pages shuffled, clips were scanned. Highlighters traced lines that suddenly seemed less certain. The hunt for the so-called smoking gun grew more desperate with every passing second. Her co-hosts watched in visible discomfort. What had begun as a coordinated challenge was unraveling in real time. Their expressions told the story before anyone spoke: apprehension, dread, and the dawning realization that the gambit had failed spectacularly. "I shouldn't have to read your own words back to you," Whoopi finally said, deflecting, her tone shifting into something brittle and defensive. "You know what you said." She hesitated, then added, "and more importantly, you know what you meant." "No," Kevin replied. His voice was calm now, but cold, not the calm of diplomacy, the calm of certainty. "No," he repeated, the unmistakable edge of anger threading through every syllable. "That's where you're wrong." He held her gaze. "You do not get to decide what I meant. You do not get to rewrite my intent because it fits a narrative you find convenient." Another pause. "That is not accountability," he said quietly. "That is fabrication." And in that moment, with the cameras still rolling and the silence stretching unbearably long, it became painfully clear to everyone watching this was no longer about a movie. No longer about Hollywood, no longer even about politics. This was about control, and control, once challenged, does not surrender quietly. "I think you absolutely do need to read those words," Kevin Costner said, his voice no longer measured but sharpened into something dangerous. "Because what is occurring right now is a deliberate assassination of my character, one founded entirely on hearsay and twisted versions of statements ripped completely out of their original context." The sentence landed with force, echoing through the studio like a dropped gauntlet. Somewhere off camera, a producer mouthed a silent curse. Behind the scenes, panic spread. The once safe harbor of a commercial break became a whispered prayer on the producer's lips as they scrambled frantically, fingers flying across switchboards, headsets crackling with overlapping commands. What had begun as a routine promotional appearance, an actor smiling politely while discussing a new film, had spiraled into something volatile and uncontrollable, but the bell had not yet rung. Kevin Costner was not finished. And neither was Whoopi Goldberg. If anything, the real battle was only just beginning. When the broadcast resumed after the break, the studio no longer merely felt tense, it crackled. The atmosphere was a live wire humming with open hostility, charged with egos, grievances, and millions of unseen eyes watching from living rooms across the country. Kevin Costner sat rigid in his chair, bolted in place like a monument to defiance. The legendary composure that had defined decades of red carpets and press junkets had been burned away under the heat of accusation, leaving behind something rawer, an anger tightly leashed, but unmistakably present. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders squared, his eyes fixed forward with unwavering intensity. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg adjusted her posture, fully aware that her initial ambush had not gone as planned. Where she had expected retreat or careful deflection, she had met resistance, and so, instinctively, she doubled down, preparing a sharper, more forceful assault. "We're back with Kevin Costner," Whoopi announced, her voice adopting a veneer of forced cheerfulness for the nationwide audience. The practiced cadence of daytime television slipped seamlessly into place, and we were just engaged in a spirited discussion about some of his recent public statements. A spirited discussion. Kevin cut in immediately, slicing through the pleasantries before they could settle. "Is that the new term for willful misrepresentation?" A ripple of unease passed through the audience. "Because I believe your viewers deserve to know." He continued, leaning forward now, "that you are accusing me of statements I have never uttered. And when I ask you to produce these so-called quotes, these words you claim define my character, you are unable to do so." For an infinitesimal moment, so brief it might have been missed by anyone not trained in reading faces, Whoopi's on-air smile faltered. A fissure appeared in the mask before it was swiftly sealed shut. "Kevin," she said coolly, "I do not appreciate being labeled a liar on my own program, nor do I appreciate being defamed on national television." "Defamed?" Kevin shot back, his voice climbing now, the restraint finally slipping. "You lured me here under a complete false pretense. This was supposed to be a conversation about my new film, my work, not a gotcha spectacle built on imaginary quotes and implied motives. The tension reached such a pitch that even the seasoned hosts felt compelled to intervene. Joy Behar leaned forward, her tone conciliatory, hands raised slightly, as though to calm two boxers circling the ring. "Maybe we should talk about the new movie," she offered carefully. "That's what people tuned in for." "No," Whoopi said sharply. The interruption was surgical, precise. Sensing retreat, she cut it off before it could take hold. "I believe it is vital that we dissect this right now," Whoopi continued, her voice firm. "Kevin, you are radiating defensiveness over statements that, if they were merely taken out of context, as you insist, should be simple to untangle." Kevin exhaled slowly, then leaned into the storm. He met her gaze directly, a challenger locking eyes with a champion, neither willing to blink. "I'm defensive," he said evenly, "because what's happening here is a masterclass in sensationalism, a collective intake of breath swept through the audience. You're fabricating a narrative." He continued, each word deliberate, "a reality that does not exist. You construct a storyline, assign it to me, and then demand I defend myself against your creation. That is not accountability. That is not journalism." His voice dropped slightly, growing colder. "And perhaps," he added, "that's a world you're unfamiliar with." The reaction was immediate. A tremor moved through the studio audience, gasps, whispers, hands flying to mouths. The sheer audacity of it was undeniable. Kevin Costner, live on air, openly challenging a titan of the entertainment industry on her own stage. The cameras lingered on Whoopi. A shadow passed across her face, dark and unmistakable. The jovial host was gone, replaced by something steelier, something deeply offended. The room seemed to contract around her, the weight of decades of influence pressing invisibly against the moment. This was no longer about quotes or context. This was about power, and as the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, everyone in the studio knew it. The moment of impact had arrived. On her own stage, under her own lights, in front of a loyal daytime audience, he had openly questioned the very foundation of her credibility, not indirectly, not subtly, but plainly, and on live television. "Excuse me," Whoopi Goldberg's voice dropped suddenly, lowered to a near whisper, yet the quiet carried more weight than any shout she had delivered all morning. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. "Are you implying," she asked slowly, "that I am ignorant of my own profession?" The moment stretched. Kevin did not hesitate. "I am implying," he replied, his tone chillingly level, stripped of all diplomacy, "that what is happening right now is not journalism." He paused, eyes fixed on hers. "It is character assassination," he continued, veiled as an interview. A murmur rippled through the studio. "You invited me here to discuss a film," Kevin said, his voice firm but controlled. "And instead, without warning, you launched an offensive built on quotes you cannot even present in their original form." He spread his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in challenge. "What name," he asked evenly, "would you give that?" The question detonated. With a sudden, violent jolt, Whoopi rose to her feet. Her chair scraped sharply against the floor as her papers slipped from her grasp, scattering across the stage like leaves caught in a storm. "I call it accountability," she declared, her voice raised now, vibrating with conviction. "Accountability for one's words and deeds," she pointed toward Kevin, "a concept," she added coldly, "that seems utterly foreign in your rarefied, privileged world." For the first time, Kevin's composure visibly cracked. "My privileged world," he repeated, disbelief slicing through his voice. A collision of fury and hurt surged beneath his restraint. "Whoopi," he said, his voice trembling, not with weakness, but with restrained outrage. "My story began in a working-class family in California." The studio went still. "Every single thing I have," he continued, "was earned, forged through decades of relentless work. No shortcuts, no safety nets." He stepped forward slightly. "So do not presume," he said sharply, "to lecture me on privilege from a throne built on accusations you cannot substantiate. Facts." Whoopi scoffed. A bitter, incredulous laugh escaped her lips, echoing uncomfortably across the set. "The facts," she said, shaking her head, "are that you said those things, and now you're desperately trying to rewrite history because the world is finally holding you to them." Her voice hardened. "The undeniable fact is this. You are a symbol of everything stagnant and broken in this industry. The old guard, the old regime, men who want the world to stay exactly the way it's always been. In a mirrored motion, Kevin stood as well. At over 6 feet tall, his presence instantly changed the physical geometry of the space. He did not loom, but he commanded, "The only thing I represent," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "is an artist who walked into this studio in good faith, only to step directly into a perfectly laid ambush." He gestured toward the scattered papers on the floor. "And the only old regime I see," he continued, "is the one that believes a person's name can be destroyed with shadows, insinuations, and twisted truths. Tear down your reputation." Whoopi scoffed again, dismissiveness dripping from every syllable. "Kevin, your reputation is perfectly safe," she said. "You are wealthy, you are powerful, you are protected." She crossed her arms. "Your reputation is bulletproof." And there it was. Kevin's voice dropped suddenly, unnervingly quiet. Not angry, not defensive, clear, calm, dangerously precise. "The true agenda," he said softly, "finally reveals itself." The studio held its breath. "This was never about anything I may or may not have said," he continued. "This was always about who I am, and where I come from." He looked directly at her. "You decided my guilt before I ever opened my mouth," he said, "based on my race, based on my gender." A sharp intake of breath could be heard from somewhere off camera. "And now," Kevin concluded, "you are torturing the evidence to fit a verdict you reached long before I arrived." Panic flickered across the faces of the other hosts. This was no longer uncomfortable television. This was dangerous territory. One host leaned forward urgently, voice cracking with forced calm. "Perhaps we should know," Kevin cut in immediately. His voice resonated with a newfound authority, clear, commanding, and final. "No," he repeated, and in that instant everyone understood. This was no longer Whoopi's show, no longer a panel discussion, no longer an interview. It was a reckoning, and the cameras were still rolling.